Sometimes, family can be the cruelest. The quote was printed on thick, high-quality paper, the kind meant to be preserved. The handwriting was flawless, elegant, precise, and unmistakably her sister Melanie's. Perfect, just like her life. Elizabeth adjusted the light gray silk dress she had chosen for the evening, smoothing out an imaginary wrinkle before checking her reflection in the glass doors of the restaurant. Her makeup was understated yet refined, a quiet sophistication that matched the simple pearl necklace resting at her collarbone, a gift she had bought herself the day she opened her first restaurant 10 years ago. Lane's Own, perched on the top floor of the Four Seasons Hotel in Boston, was an opulent space with sweeping views of the Beacon Hill skyline. It was a blend of classic Boston tradition and sleek modernity, the kind of place frequented by the city's elite. Elizabeth wasn't surprised this venue had been chosen. After all, she had heard that her sister's husband, James Clark, often entertained his investment banking clients here. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" Elizabeth handed over the invitation, unfazed by the hostess's quick once-over. "The Wilson Clark baby shower." The hostess checked the guest list, and Elizabeth could already imagine what was written next to her name. Sister of the hostess. Works at a pub. That lie had taken root a decade ago, and her family had never bothered to correct it. Or rather, they had preferred it that way. Inside, the venue was already filled with guests draped in designer dresses, effortlessly balancing champagne glasses as they exchanged polished pleasantries. The tables were covered in crisp white linens, each adorned with pastel blue floral centerpieces. The lighting from the chandeliers cast a soft golden glow over the gathering. And at the heart of it all stood Melanie, 7 months pregnant, glowing, looking like she had stepped straight out of a luxury maternity advertisement. She wore an elegant couture dress, a diamond necklace from James sparkling at her throat. Their mother, Carol, stood beside her, the picture of high society perfection, her hair and makeup flawlessly done, her dress a quiet but unmistakable display of wealth. They were surrounded by the members of the Newton Country Club, a social scene that thrived on exclusivity and appearances. Carol had always been obsessed with reputation. As a former real estate agent who had climbed her way into the upper class, she had strict expectations for her daughters, and at least Melanie had lived up to them. Elizabeth, on the other hand, had been a disappointment. "Well, Elizabeth, you actually came." Her mother's voice held a familiar blend of surprise and subtle disapproval, a tone Elizabeth had heard too many times to count. For the past decade, their meetings had been limited to obligatory family events, once or twice a year at most. It had been a mutual decision. Carol and Melanie lived in a world of pristine suburban mansions, exclusive fundraisers, and carefully curated appearances. Elizabeth, in contrast, had built a quiet but fulfilling life downtown. Or at least, that's what her family believed. In reality, she was the owner and executive chef of the Hidden Gem, one of the most sought-after restaurants in Boston. Nestled in a restored red brick building in Beacon Hill, her restaurant was a favorite among Harvard professors and Boston's old money families. It operated purely on word of mouth and glowing reviews from top-tier food critics. There was always a 3-month waiting list, and reservations were impossible to get without connections. But her family knew none of this. She had deliberately kept it that way. Elizabeth glanced around, noticing the carefully arranged place cards at each table. Yet, no matter where she looked, her name was nowhere to be found. Whispers floated through the room, pointed, deliberate. "Is that the sister everyone talks about? She works at a pub, right?" Elizabeth took a slow, steady breath and smiled, an expression of quiet confidence honed over years. She walked further into the room, passing tables draped in pristine linens, their pastel floral arrangements meticulously arranged. The murmurs followed her like a breeze, pausing briefly before picking up again as she passed. 10 tables, each seating 12. Every seat had a name card. None had hers. At the far end of the room, hotel staff moved carefully, placing trays of finger foods, smoked salmon, caviar-topped blinis, and truffle-infused quiche. Elizabeth's trained eye caught small imperfections in their presentation. A professional chef never stops noticing details. "Elizabeth, even though you came all this way," Melanie approached, her voice carrying the artificial warmth of someone making a grand, unnecessary effort. Elizabeth met her gaze, but didn't speak. James stood just behind Melanie, studying Elizabeth with the sharp, calculating expression of a man who assessed everything for its value, like a stock portfolio. "We had a sudden increase in guests, you see," Melanie said, her tone syrupy sweet, her expression feigning regret. "We had to prioritize our important guests." Elizabeth understood exactly what that meant. She wasn't important. She never would be. Melanie's face brightened suddenly, as if struck by a brilliant idea. "But don't worry," she chirped. "Why don't you try that dingy pub across the street? That might be more your style." Laughter rippled through the nearby guests, spreading like the bubbles in their champagne glasses. Carol stepped forward, wearing a self-satisfied smile. "Yes, that would be perfect for you." Elizabeth inhaled slowly. 10 years. 10 years of distance. 10 years of success. 10 years of becoming someone completely different. And yet, standing here now, she realized nothing had changed in their eyes. She let the moment stretch, then smiled, graceful, poised, utterly unbothered. "I'll do that." She turned with quiet elegance, heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Behind her, Melanie and Carol exchanged victorious glances. The whispers continued, evolving into new gossip before she had even left the room. Elizabeth reached the hallway, pausing by a tall window overlooking the glowing Boston skyline. They thought they had dismissed her. As the evening lights flickered between the buildings, Elizabeth gazed across the street, where the warm glow of the hidden gem stood, quietly reigning over Beacon Hill. Behind her, Melanie and Carol watched through the hotel's grand windows, silhouetted against the setting sun. Elizabeth's posture, illuminated by the golden light, carried a regal dignity, one that could have belonged to royalty. Yet, to her mother and sister, she appeared as nothing more than a pathetic outsider. Elizabeth turned and walked toward the elevator, her steps lighter than before. The time for truth was drawing near, and soon they would see her for who she truly was. Retrieving her jacket from the front desk, she exited the hotel and crossed the street. Behind her, Carol and Melanie exchanged smug smiles, pleased with their small victory. What they didn't realize was that their satisfaction would be short-lived. As Elizabeth strode toward the pub across the street, she pulled out her phone. A new message lit up her screen. Michelin inspector scheduled visit confirmed. A graceful smile played at her lips. 1 week later, Carol sat at the breakfast table, skimming the Boston Globe as she did every morning. A bold headline stretched across the front page. "The Hidden Gem, Boston's Culinary Treasure." Accompanying the article was a spread of stunning photographs, glistening dishes plated to perfection, the rich ambience of the exclusive restaurant, and beneath it all, a single name, Chef Liz. "James, look at this," Carol said, her voice sharp with intrigue. Melanie, sipping her coffee, leaned over James's shoulder. "The Hidden Gem? Isn't that the impossible-to-book restaurant?" The article delved deep into the establishment's mystique, describing how the intimate 20-seat dining room was tucked inside a beautifully restored red brick building in Beacon Hill. Crystal chandeliers and antique furnishings adorned the space, giving it a timeless elegance. "Even Harvard's president dines there regularly," James remarked, clearly impressed. Executives at my firm have been trying to get reservations for months. The wait list is ridiculous. Carol read on, each word tightening a knot in her chest. Chef Liz had quietly founded the restaurant 10 years ago, her reputation growing steadily as she introduced innovative French-inspired cuisine. She had trained at a prestigious 3 Michelin-star restaurant in France before opening her own. She had already earned 2 Michelin stars and was rumored to be in the running for a third. We should try to get a reservation, Melanie suggested, her voice uncertain. But booking a table at the Hidden Gem wasn't that simple. When they called the restaurant, they were told reservations were only accepted through personal recommendations, and the recommender had to be an existing, verified guest. How pretentious, Carol muttered, setting down the phone, her pride wounded by the exclusivity. That afternoon, while shopping in Beacon Hill, she found herself near the Hidden Gem. The sun cast a warm glow over the old brick facade, its exterior offering no hint of the world within. Then, something unexpected happened. A sleek luxury car pulled up in front of the restaurant, and Elizabeth stepped out. Carol's breath caught. Her daughter wasn't in a chef's coat or work attire, but she carried herself with an unfamiliar grace, one that spoke of confidence and quiet authority. Then, from the same car, emerged a renowned artist, someone Carol had seen on television before. The two of them spoke like old friends. Elizabeth, thank you for another extraordinary meal. I was moved, as always. Elizabeth smiled warmly. The honor is mine. Thank you for coming. Carol froze in place. Inside the restaurant, staff members stepped out one by one, bowing slightly as they greeted Elizabeth, not as a coworker, but as a leader. Then, a man in a pristine chef's uniform approached her. Chef, regarding today's Michelin inspector visit. Elizabeth nodded, completely unfazed. Proceed as usual. Carol stood there, hidden behind the building, watching everything unfold. The daughter she had dismissed for 10 years as a lowly pub worker was, in reality, a revered chef, respected by Boston's elite. And they had been completely blind to it. That evening Carol rushed home and immediately called Melanie. I saw something unbelievable today. Melanie, sensing the urgency in her mother's voice, put her on speaker for James to hear. I saw Elizabeth at the Hidden Gem. And not just as a guest, she belongs there. No, she's more than that. She runs the place. Silence. That's not possible, Melanie whispered, her voice trembling. But the pieces were starting to click together. The way Elizabeth never engaged in their social circles. The subtle but undeniable knowledge she had of fine dining. The distance she had maintained for a decade. That night, unable to shake the suspicion, Melanie and James began researching the Hidden Gem in depth. Its website was elusive, only listing Chef Liz's credentials with no photograph. But food blogs, gourmet magazine, and critic reviews were overflowing with praise for her culinary mastery. Then, in an archived interview, Melanie found something chilling. Chef Liz trained at a 3 Michelin-star restaurant in France before returning to Boston 10 years ago. 10 years ago, James repeated. That's exactly when Elizabeth distanced herself from the family. Melanie opened her phone's gallery and scrolled to the baby shower photos. There, at the very end, was a shot of Elizabeth's back as she exited the venue. Looking at it now, Melanie realized something. Her posture wasn't that of someone defeated. It was composed, confident. Did we? Melanie's voice trailed off, swallowed by the darkness of the room. The next morning Carol returned to the Hidden Gem, this time during early morning prep. Delivery trucks pulled up, unloading premium ingredients, the kind used only in the highest caliber restaurants. And there, overseeing every detail, was Elizabeth. Dressed in a crisp white chef's coat, she moved with effortless authority, inspecting each ingredient with precision. Her staff listened to her every word, responding with unwavering trust. Carol stood in stunned silence, gripping the strap of her handbag. She had spent years convinced Elizabeth was a failure, someone unworthy of their world. But the truth was undeniable. The daughter she had belittled was a Michelin-starred chef, and they had never even noticed. 2 weeks after the baby shower, the revelation became public when Taste of Boston, the city's premier gourmet magazine, ran a full-length feature on the Hidden Gem's 10th anniversary. And there, for the first time, was a photograph of Elizabeth, smiling, poised, and wearing her signature chef's coat. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Prominently displayed on the Taste of Boston cover, Elizabeth stood in the heart of her kitchen, poised and confident in her crisp white chef's coat. The headline beside her image read, "The True Face of Chef Liz, the story behind the 2 Michelin-star Hidden Gem." Melanie happened to pick up the magazine while waiting for her prenatal checkup. The moment she saw her sister's face staring back at her, her hands trembled. She nearly collapsed into the waiting room chair. Elizabeth Wilson. Not just her sister, the woman she had mocked and dismissed, but the acclaimed chef Liz, the mastermind behind one of Boston's most exclusive restaurants. The article unraveled a reality that Melanie had never known. After graduating from Boston University a decade ago, Elizabeth had trained in some of the most prestigious restaurants in France, honing her craft under the guidance of culinary legends. When she returned to the U.S., she wasted no time. She opened the Hidden Gem, not as an ambitious experiment, but as the protege of the world-renowned chef Jean-Pierre Duval. Her culinary career had never been a stroke of luck. It had been meticulously crafted from the start. The cuisine of Chef Liz, also known as Elizabeth Wilson, blends classical French techniques with modern artistry. Her signature dish, Landscape of Memories, pays homage to French traditions while celebrating the finest New England ingredients. A dish not just meant to be eaten, but experienced. Melanie was so absorbed in the article that she forgot all about her prenatal checkup. Elizabeth wasn't just respected. She was revered by the world's top gastronomes. The Hidden Gem wasn't just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary of culture, art, and intellectual exchange. Harvard professors, world-renowned artists, literary icons, they all dined there, finding refuge in its intimate, exclusive setting. However, it wasn't fame that defined Elizabeth's approach. The article made that clear. Chef Liz does not seek popularity. Reservations are limited, and only guests who truly appreciate her vision are welcomed. Securing a table requires a letter of recommendation from an existing patron. This philosophy reflects her unwavering commitment to preserving the authenticity of her craft. Melanie could barely breathe as she reached for her phone. She dialed their mother immediately, but Carol had already seen the article. She sat in her pristine living room, her hands shaking as she reread it over and over, as if trying to absorb a truth she had refused to acknowledge for years. Elizabeth Wilson's restaurant wasn't just successful. It was a symbol of everything she and Melanie had spent their lives chasing. And the woman they had dismissed as an embarrassment had already built a seat at the very table they had longed to join. That evening at an executive meeting at the investment bank, James sat uncharacteristically silent, a hint of unease settling over his normally composed expression. One of the senior partners smirked from across the long conference table. "James, is it true that the Hidden Gem's owner, Chef Liz, is your sister-in-law?" Heads turned. James felt their collective gazes pierce through him. "We've been trying to get a reservation for months. You'd think having a family connection would help." The silence that followed was unbearable. James had never mentioned Elizabeth's career. In fact, for years, he had casually implied that his sister-in-law worked at a pub. Now he was trapped. How could he explain the lie? Swallowing hard, he forced an apologetic smile. I wouldn't know the details, he said stiffly. A heavy pause filled the room. Some of the executives exchanged knowing looks. James had lost something that was valued in their world, access. That same night Carol and Melanie met outside the hidden gem. Warm light spilled from the restaurant's windows, casting a golden glow on the cobblestone street. Inside, a refined, effortless elegance filled the space. The scent of truffle-infused dishes lingered in the air, as impeccably dressed guests savored each bite of Elizabeth's creations. Harvard professors, CEOs, Boston's elite, they were all there, completely immersed in the experience Elizabeth had crafted for them. Melody's hands clenched into fists. "What have we done?" she whispered. For years, they had mocked her, excluded her, pushed her to the sidelines. And yet, Elizabeth had not only risen above their contempt, she had surpassed them in every way possible. Carol exhaled sharply, overwhelmed with a realization she could no longer ignore. She had judged her daughter for a decade based on superficial values, never bothering to see who she truly was. And now, the truth was inescapable. Elizabeth had built something extraordinary, without them. The next morning, determined to mend things, Carol gathered her courage and called the hidden gem. The receptionist answered with polite professionalism. "Hello, I'd like to make a reservation." As expected, the response was swift. "Reservations require a letter of recommendation from an existing guest, ma'am." Carol hesitated. She took a breath. I am Elizabeth Wilson's mother," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There was silence on the other end. Then, the receptionist replied carefully, "Please hold while I check with the chef." Carol waited, clutching the phone like a lifeline. A minute passed. Then another. Finally, the receptionist returned. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but the chef has requested that you follow the normal reservation procedure." Carol's chest tightened. Elizabeth had denied her. And in that moment, 10 years of disdain, dismissal, and cold indifference came crashing down on her all at once. She had spent a decade treating her daughter as a disappointment. And now, Elizabeth was making it clear she was no longer part of her world. That same morning, despite being less than a month from her due date, Melanie drove to the hidden gem, unable to stay away. She needed to see Elizabeth. She needed to understand. Almost every day, Melanie found herself near the hidden gem, watching from afar. The rich aroma of expertly crafted dishes drifted from the restaurant, carrying with it the quiet hum of satisfied conversation. Customers came and went, their expressions content, their laughter light. She could only observe. One afternoon, summoning her courage, Melanie finally stepped inside. The moment she entered, a polite but firm voice greeted her. "We apologize, but we are fully booked today. Reservations require a letter of recommendation from an existing guest." It was the sous chef, his tone professional and unwavering. Just then, Elizabeth stepped out from the kitchen. Their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, Melanie held her breath, hoping for something, recognition, warmth, maybe even forgiveness. But Elizabeth's gaze was calm, detached, like she was looking at a stranger. Then she spoke. "Do you have a letter of recommendation, ma'am?" Those words weighed heavier than a decade of estrangement. Melanie fled the restaurant in tears. Outside, she saw a row of luxury cars lined up along the street, patrons arriving, eager for an experience that was crafted by her sister's hands. The very world she and her mother had aspired to join now belonged to Elizabeth, and they had never even known it. A few days later, Carol and Melanie found an envelope in their mailbox. The handwriting was flawless, the paper high quality. Elizabeth's writing. Inside was a short note. "True value lies not in superficial decoration, but in essence. If you are ready to understand that, you know where to find me." A month after receiving Elizabeth's letter, Melanie gave birth to a baby girl. In her hospital room, surrounded by extravagant floral arrangements from friends and social acquaintances, one bouquet stood out. Smaller, simpler, but undeniably more thoughtful. It was from the hidden gem. The attached card carried only one word: "Congratulations." But the handwriting was unmistakable. Melanie held the bouquet close, the delicate scent of seasonal wildflowers filling the room. Unlike the other lavish arrangements, this one felt different, gentle, personal, warm. It reminded her of Elizabeth's food. "Mom," Melanie murmured, cradling her newborn. "What should we do?" Carol stared silently out the window. She had already called the hidden gem multiple times, trying to make a reservation. Each time, she had received only polite refusals. Then, one day, another letter arrived. The proposal. "If you truly want to understand, why don't you try working at the restaurant? Start from the bottom. To understand essence, one must begin with the basics." Carol and Melanie sat in stunned silence, the weight of Elizabeth's words sinking in. To work at the hidden gem? Their nouveau riche pride screamed no, absolutely not. And yet, they had no other options left. 3 months later, Melanie stepped into the hidden gem's kitchen for the first time. Not as a guest, not as Elizabeth's sister, but as a dishwasher. Carol, despite her status and past pride, took on a role as a dining room assistant. The first few weeks were brutal. Melanie's hands, once accustomed to luxury, became rough and sore from scrubbing dishes. Carol's feet ached like never before, exhaustion settling into muscles she never knew existed. And Elizabeth? She showed them no special treatment. No favors. No shortcuts. Things of value take time to understand. That was all she said. A shift begins slowly. Something changed. As Melanie washed dishes, she started noticing the passion woven into each of Elizabeth's creations. The precision, the care, the soul. Carol, working in the dining room, witnessed firsthand the joy on customers' faces, the way their eyes lit up with every bite, the way Elizabeth's dishes seemed to tell a story. It was a world they had never truly seen before. They were no longer looking at status, luxury, or exclusivity. For the first time, they were beginning to understand true value. 6 months later, during a staff tasting session after a meeting, Melanie finally had her first bite of Elizabeth's cooking. She took a spoonful and froze. The flavors, the depth, the care, the years of experience, it was all there. Her vision blurred. Tears streamed down her face. Because in that dish, she could feel it. 10 years of her sister's feelings. Everything Elizabeth had never said. Everything they had ignored. 1 year later, Carol was officially hired as permanent dining room staff. Melanie had moved from dishwashing to apprentice cook, learning culinary basics from scratch. Their attitudes, their values, they had transformed. The glamorous social circles that once held their devotion, they meant nothing now. Carol even started attending psychological counseling, finally confronting the shallow ideals she had clung to for years. Melanie, once indifferent to hard work, now approached cooking with sincere dedication. And then one night, after closing, Elizabeth called them over. She stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Then she spoke. "Starting tomorrow, shall we meet as family?" Carol choked up. Melanie covered her mouth with her hands. They had expected forgiveness to be out of reach forever. But this was something more. This wasn't just reconciliation. This was a new beginning. A Sunday morning like no other the following Sunday, the hidden gem did something unprecedented. For the first time, it opened in the morning. Not for VIP guests. Not for Michelin inspectors. But for family. Carol, Melanie, and the now 18-month-old baby sat at a private table, watching as Elizabeth brought out the first dish. The food was simple. No extravagant plating, no elaborate garnishes. Just pure, heartfelt cooking. A meal made with love. A bouquet of wildflowers sat at the center of the table, the same kind Elizabeth had sent to the hospital the day Melanie gave birth. Elizabeth placed a dish in front of them, then finally smiled. "This is my true feeling," she said. "I'm proud that you've learned to see essence rather than appearance." Carol and Melanie nodded through their tears. Outside, the Boston streets were bathed in the warm glow of morning light. Inside, the red brick walls of the hidden gem stood as silent witnesses to a moment that had been a decade in the making. This was not an ending. It was the dawn of something new. A family rebuilt, not on appearances, not on status, but on understanding true value.